You know the stories: machine guns in no man's land, gas attacks that turn battlefields into graveyards, artillery barrages that shake the earth for miles. But there's a fortress in eastern France where the roles flip completely. A place where the strongest fort in the world falls without a single shot fired. In the chalky hills of Verdun, a fortress so mighty it took 2.5 million cubic meters of concrete to build becomes a tomb for its own defenders. Who breaks into this impregnable citadel? How does the world's most advanced fortification fall to 98 random German soldiers? What happens when hubris meets a man with nothing to lose? Fort Douaumont sits like a concrete mountain on the highest ground around Verdun, 530 meters long. 30,000 square meters of surface area. 12 meters of steel reinforced concrete protecting 2 underground levels. By 1916, military experts call it the strongest fortification on Earth. The French spent 30 years perfecting it after their crushing defeat in the Franco-Prussian War. 2 concentric rings of barbed wire, 8-foot sharpened stakes, machine gun positions covering every approach, underground galleries with enough supplies for a year-long siege. This is the keystone holding together 19 massive forts defending Verdun, the place where Germany's Crown Prince Wilhelm expects to bleed France white. February 25th, 1916, day 4 of the Battle of Verdun. German Fifth Army has already fired over 1 million shells in the opening barrage alone. The 24th Brandenburg Regiment pushes forward through a blinding snowstorm, their target a patch of woods 750 meters in front of Fort Douaumont. But when they advance, they find the French Zouaves have already fled. The Brandenburgers surge past their objective, taking 1,200 meters of ground in 25 minutes. On the far left flank, 10 combat engineers led by Pioneer Sergeant Felix Kunze find themselves staring up at the fortress itself. Kunze is 24 years old, a Thuringian farm boy turned soldier. His job today is clearing obstacles and barbed wire for the main assault troops, but his blood is already up. Earlier that morning, he gave first aid to a wounded French NCO in a captured blockhouse. When Kunze left, the ungrateful Frenchman remanned his machine gun and opened fire. Kunze killed him, then picked off a French sniper minutes later. Now Fort Douaumont looms above him like a concrete cliff. The observation cupolas are silent, machine gun positions empty. Only one 155mm gun fires sporadically from the main turret. Something is wrong. The fort should be bristling with defenders, should have 500 men manning its guns, should have officers coordinating fields of fire that could massacre an entire regiment. Instead, Sergeant Major Chenot commands exactly 56 territorial gunners. Middle-aged reservists, the highest-ranking soldier in the most important fort in France is a non-commissioned officer. Why? Because General Joseph Joffre made the worst tactical decision in French military history. In August 1915, convinced that modern artillery could destroy any fortification, he stripped Fort Douaumont of its garrison and most of its weapons. The 475mm guns in the casemate de Bourges bunkers are gone. Sent to prepare for the Somme offensive, the machine guns are packed away in storage boxes. The drawbridge is jammed in the down position by a German shell and never repaired. 11,000 pounds of explosives wait in the fort's magazines to demolish it if the Germans get too close. Pioneer Sergeant Kunze and his men reach the outer defenses. 30 feet of barbed wire should stop them cold, but German artillery has blown gaps in the wire. The combat engineers slip through, wire cutters ready. No machine gun fire rakes them from the coffries. The wall bunkers defending the dry moat sit empty. Visibility is almost zero in the swirling snow. French machine gunners in Douaumont village mistake the mud-covered Germans for colonial troops returning from patrol. The field gray uniforms look exactly like French horizon blue in the dim light. The Germans have even unscrewed their spiked helmets so they won't catch in the forest undergrowth. Kunze reaches the edge of the moat, 7 meters deep, 24 feet straight down to the bottom. His men form up behind him, wondering how they'll cross this obstacle. A German artillery shell makes the decision for them. The blast lifts Sergeant Kunze off his feet and hurls him into the moat. Stunned but unhurt, he orders his squad to follow. 9 men drop into the ditch. 1 corporal refuses, convinced his sergeant has lost his mind. Now 10 German soldiers crouch in the fortress moat, the most dangerous place on the Western Front. Artillery pounds the fort above them. Concrete fragments rain down, but not a single French soldier fires at them. The pioneers approach a gun gallery. Steel doors block the entrance. But the guns inside have gone silent. Kunze orders his men to form a human pyramid against the concrete wall. Standing on their shoulders, he climbs up to an embrasure window. It's open. No guards, no sentries. Pioneer Sergeant Felix Kunze becomes the first German soldier to enter Fort Douaumont. Armed with only a bolt-action rifle and a Luger pistol, he drops into the world's strongest fortress. Behind him, his men refuse to follow. They're sure this is a trap. That hundreds of French soldiers wait in ambush. Kunze enters the dark tunnels alone. If you value documented military history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from the German Federal Military Archives at Freiburg and Dr. Christina Holstein's detailed forensic analysis published in the Western Front Association's Proceedings in 2025. Based on newly discovered testimony from Oberreichsbahnrat Captain Eugen Radke and the witness report of German staff Dr. B. Hallauer. Now back to the information. The tunnels stretch in every direction. Two main galleries run east to west on different levels. Smaller corridors branch off to gun positions, storage rooms, and barracks. Electric lights flicker along the ceiling. Telephone wires connect observation posts to command centers. This underground city was built to house 800 men in wartime. Today it holds 56 scared territorial soldiers hiding from the German bombardment. Sergeant Kunze wanders through empty corridors. Following the sound of voices, he finds them in a turret position. Two powder-blackened French gunners operating the 155mm gun. Hände hoch, Kunze shouts, raising his Luger. The French artillerymen have no idea what's happening. Before they can react, he hustles them out at gunpoint. But when they reach an open courtyard inside the fort, the prisoners bolt back into the tunnels. Kunze chases them through the maze of corridors. He's completely lost now, alone in enemy territory with no backup. Then luck finds him. Following voices down a side passage, he stumbles into a storage room where most of the fort's garrison sits listening to a lecture. Sergeant Major Chenot and 26 French reservists look up in shock at the mud-covered German pointing a rifle at them. Kunze realizes immediately that if they rush him, he's dead. 27 against 1 in a confined space. No chance. Thinking fast, he backs toward the door. Hände hoch! He shouts again, waving the rifle. The French soldiers start to stand up, confused by this lone German who appeared from nowhere. The lights flicker and go out. In the darkness, Kunze slams the storage room door and turns the lock. 27 French soldiers are now trapped in their own fort by a single German sergeant who got lost in the tunnels. But Kunze isn't finished. Wandering the corridors again, he encounters another French soldier. This one is unarmed and terrified. Mon capitaine, the Frenchman keeps saying, mistaking the muddy sergeant for an officer. Kunze forces him to lead the way to the officer's mess. There he sits down for a meal of bread and fried eggs while his prisoner watches in bewilderment. The German hasn't eaten all day. The French soldiers are locked up. For the first time since entering the fort, Pioneer Sergeant Felix Kunze allows himself to relax. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Eugen Radke approaches the fortress with 20 men from the 24th Brandenburg's 6th Company. A 40-year-old reservist who looks more like a shopkeeper than a soldier behind his wire-rimmed glasses. But Radke notices what his commanders missed. The fort's guns have gone silent except for that single turret. No defensive fire rakes the approaches. This doesn't look like a fortress preparing for siege. When German shells continue falling on Douaumont, Radke's men crawl on hands and knees across the glacis to avoid their own artillery. They find the same gaps in the wire that Kunze used, the same unmanned defenses. Radke enters through a different breach in the wall. His path takes him to the top of the main fort, where shellfire has blown open another entrance. He captures his first group of French prisoners, who tell him the garrison is tiny and most are hiding in the lower levels, room by room. Corridor by corridor, Radke and his men spread through the fortress. They meet no organized resistance, find no prepared defensive positions. The strongest fort in the world is falling to 20 German soldiers who weren't even supposed to be here. Captain Hans Joachim Haupt arrives next with portions of a full company. Now nearly 100 German soldiers occupy Fort Douaumont. Lieutenant Voigt, Kunze's superior officer, finds his pioneer sergeant finishing his meal in the officer's mess. The threads come together. German soldiers spread through every level of the fortress, securing gun positions, ammunition stores, and the remaining French prisoners. By late afternoon, Fort Douaumont belongs to the German army. Total German casualties, one scraped knee when a soldier slipped climbing into the moat. Total shots fired, 0. But the last German officer to enter the fort writes the victory dispatch. Second Lieutenant Kurt von Brandis, a 23-year-old Prussian aristocrat, sends word back to Crown Prince Wilhelm that Fort Douaumont has fallen heroically to German arms. He mentions no one else by name, not Pioneer Sergeant Kunze, who first entered the fortress and captured half the garrison single-handed, not Lieutenant Radke, who organized the actual seizure of the fort, not Captain Haupt, who secured the final positions. Von Brandis takes credit for the greatest feat of arms on the Western Front. 2 weeks later, Crown Prince Wilhelm presents the Pour le Mérite, Germany's highest military decoration, to the hero of Douaumont. Second Lieutenant von Brandis becomes a national celebrity. His photograph appears in every German newspaper. He writes a novel called The Stormers of Douaumont that places him at the center of the action. Captain Haupt receives the Blue Max a month later. Pioneer Sergeant Felix Kunze, the man who actually captured Fort Douaumont, receives nothing, not a medal, not a promotion, not even a mention in the official reports. It will take 20 years and a team of military historians to set the record straight. The fall of Fort Douaumont shocks France to its core. General Philippe Pétain rushed to Verdun to save the situation, calls it a disaster that will cost 100,000 French lives to reverse. The fortress becomes Old Uncle Douaumont to German soldiers, an invulnerable base just behind the front lines. French artillery pounds it with millions of shells over the next 8 months. The concrete holds. Inside, German troops establish a field hospital, ammunition depot, and telecommunications center. Up to 3,000 men shelter in its tunnels during French counterattacks. The Kaiser's soldiers have turned France's greatest fortress into their greatest stronghold. But fortress life brings its own horrors. The tunnels echo with every sound. Sleep becomes impossible when 3,000 men crowd into spaces designed for 800. Stalactites of chalk drip from the ceilings. The air grows thick and poisonous from cooking fires, unwashed bodies, and fear. French gas shells penetrate the ventilation systems. Supply runs through the constant artillery barrage cost dozens of lives. And in the ammunition storage areas, German soldiers grow careless with explosives. They smoke cigarettes while sitting on cases of grenades, heat coffee with flamethrower fuel, store shells wherever they can find space in the overcrowded tunnels. May 8th, 1916, 4 o'clock in the morning. Pioneer Sergeant Kunze has been dead for 2 months, killed by a French sniper while carrying dispatches between German positions. The fortress he captured now houses units from the 12th Grenadier Regiment and 52nd Infantry Regiment, relieved from the fighting around Douaumont Farm. Hundreds of soldiers sleep in the barracks levels. Cooking fires burn in makeshift kitchens. Flamethrower fuel is stored next to hand grenades next to French 155mm shells captured when the fort fell. A cooking fire gets out of control. Soldiers try to heat coffee using flamethrower fuel instead of proper equipment. The inflammable liquid ignites, sending up clouds of thick black smoke. Panicked Germans run for the stairs, their faces blackened with soot. German sentries on the upper level mistake them for French colonial troops attacking through the tunnels. Black African soldiers have a reputation for taking no prisoners. Terrified guards throw stick grenades down the stairwells, trying to stop what they think is a French assault. The grenades explode among their own comrades, spreading fire to the Pioneer supply depot. The fire reaches a magazine of captured French shells at 6:10 a.m. The explosion sends shockwaves through every tunnel, every corridor, every room in Fort Douaumont. Steel doors buckle. Concrete walls crack. A fireball sweeps through the underground levels at the speed of a hurricane, incinerating everything in its path before blasting out through gun embrasures and ventilation shafts. The sound is heard 15 kilometers away in Verdun. A column of smoke and flame rises 200 meters above the fortress, visible from German observation posts 10 kilometers behind the lines. 1,800 German soldiers are wounded in the explosion. 679 are killed outright. Their bodies so mutilated that identification becomes impossible. Staff Dr. B. Hallauer, the fort's chief medical officer, reports that the survivors show symptoms of severe shock, confusion, loss of speech, convulsions, and raving madness. The underground levels become a charnel house, corridors filled with piles of corpses thrown into corners 3 and 4 bodies deep, men suffocated by poisonous smoke, burned beyond recognition by the fireball, crushed by falling concrete. The German command faces an impossible choice. So many bodies remain trapped in the rubble that proper burial becomes impossible. French artillery continues to pound the area around the fort, making recovery operations suicidal. Major Friedrich Schönlein, regimental commander of the 2nd Brandenburg Grenadier Regiment, dies when part of his bedroom collapses in the explosion. Captain Haupt, one of the officers who received the Pour le Mérite for capturing the fort, barely escapes with his life. German engineers examine the structure to determine if Fort Douaumont can still be defended or should be evacuated and destroyed. The fortress holds. Despite the massive internal explosion, the 12-meter concrete roof remains intact. The gun positions still function. The observation posts provide crucial intelligence on French movements. German commanders decide to keep Fort Douaumont operational, sealing the damaged areas and using the fortress as a base for continued operations. 679 German soldiers are entombed in a lower casemate, the remains walled up behind concrete and marked with a simple cross. The memorial reads, in memory of 679 German soldiers who were killed here on May 8, 1916, by the explosion of an ammunition depot. French forces never learn about the disaster. Their constant artillery bombardment masks the sound and smoke of the explosion. Intelligence reports note unusual activity around Fort Douaumont, but attribute it to normal defensive preparations. General Robert Nivelle, who replaced Pétain as commander at Verdun, continues planning massive assaults to recapture the fortress. French colonial troops from Morocco, Senegal, Somalia, and Tunisia train for the attack that will restore French honor. They have no idea that German incompetence has already accomplished what French firepower could not. The French offensive begins October 24, 1916. 3 full divisions attack Fort Douaumont after days of preparation by 2 super heavy 400mm railway guns named Alsace and Lorraine. The guns are positioned at Baillycourt, 13 kilometers southwest of Verdun, and fire day and night at the fortress. Each shell weighs over half a ton. The bombardment is so intense that German commanders order the evacuation of Fort Douaumont. As French colonial infantry swarm down from nearby Souville Hill under cover of fog, they find the fortress in the process of being abandoned. The Régiment d'Infanterie Coloniale du Maroc leads the assault. Moroccan troops storm through the same gun embrasures where Pioneer Sergeant Kunze entered 8 months earlier. They capture 6,000 German prisoners in a single day as the evacuation turns into a rout. "Douaumont is ours," writes a French staff officer. The formidable Douaumont, which dominates with its mass, its observation points, the 2 shores of the Meuse, is again French. Fort Vaux falls to French forces a week later. The German defensive line in the Verdun sector begins to collapse, but the cost has been extraordinary. French casualties at Verdun total 362,000, killed with 101,000 missing and 210,000 wounded. German losses reach 336,000 killed. Some 300,000 soldiers die fighting for a few square miles of chalky hills and ruined villages. The Battle of Verdun becomes synonymous with senseless slaughter, industrial warfare, and the grinding horror of attrition. Historians call it the longest battle in human history. 302 days of continuous combat, an average of 70,000 casualties per month, a meat grinder that consumes entire divisions. Pioneer Sergeant Félix Kunze never lives to see the French recapture of Fort Douaumont. Killed by a sniper in July 1916 while carrying messages between German units. His role in the capture of the fortress remains unknown for decades. Second Lieutenant von Brandis enjoys celebrity status throughout Germany, promoted to captain by war's end. He forms the Freikorps. Brandis, during the German Revolution of 1919, then retires to become a farmer. Though his political views lean right, he refuses to join the Nazi Party in the 1930s, dies in 1972 at age 83. Still remembered as the Hero of Douaumont. Lieutenant Eugen Radke survives the war but receives no recognition for his role in capturing Fort Douaumont until the 1930s. Military historians from the German Great War Committee finally review the official records and witness statements. They discover that von Brandis was actually the last officer to enter the fortress, not the first. That Pioneer Sergeant Kunze single-handedly captured most of the French garrison. That Lieutenant Radke organized the actual seizure of the fort while von Brandis was still approaching through the outer defenses. Justice comes too late for the real heroes. In 1935, Felix Kunze receives belated recognition. Now a police inspector in his hometown, he's promoted and given a small pension. The German government acknowledges his role in the most dramatic feat of arms on the Western Front. Lieutenant Radke receives an autographed photograph of the now deposed Crown Prince Wilhelm. It's not the pour le mérite he deserved, but it's something. The truth about Fort Douaumont finally enters the historical record, 20 years after the battle that made it famous. The fortress itself survives both world wars. During the interwar period, French engineers partially refurbish it and install new gun turrets. In June 1940, German forces capture Fort Douaumont again during the fall of France. This time, the Wehrmacht encounters no resistance. The fort surrenders without firing a shot, its garrison ordered to abandon positions by the French High Command. The German battalion commander who accepts the surrender had served in Fort Douaumont as a young officer 24 years earlier. History comes full circle in the concrete tunnels where 679 German soldiers still lie entombed. Today, Fort Douaumont stands as a memorial to the horror and heroism of the Great War. The underground galleries where Pioneer Sergeant Kunze wandered alone in 1916 now guide tourists through rooms that witnessed the most dramatic military capture in modern history. The concrete walls still bear scars from the May 8th explosion. The German military cemetery remains sealed behind its memorial wall, a reminder that victory and defeat often look identical in the darkness of war. The observation cupolas look out over ground that once ran red with blood from a dozen nations: French, German, Moroccan, Senegalese. Somali soldiers fought and died for these chalky hills. Shell craters still dot the landscape, hidden now under grass and trees. The villages of Douaumont, Fleury, Beaumont, Ornez, Louvemont, Besanvaux, and 3 others were so completely destroyed that they exist now only as names on maps. Their streets are marked by stone bollards, their populations recorded only in the rolls of the dead. September 22nd, 1984. German Chancellor Helmut Kohl and French President François Mitterrand stand hand in hand before the Douaumont ossuary, where the bones of 130,000 unidentified soldiers rest in eternal silence. The image symbolizes the Franco-German reconciliation that transformed Europe from a battlefield into a peaceful union. The fortress, where 98 German soldiers once changed the course of history, becomes a monument to the futility of war and the possibility of peace between former enemies. The deeper truth about Fort Douaumont reveals itself in the archaeological evidence. Excavations in the 1990s uncover personal artifacts from both sides scattered through the tunnels, German pipe stems next to French buttons, Moroccan colonial regiment insignia mixed with Thuringian regimental badges. The fort becomes a time capsule of the First Industrial War, where soldiers from across 3 continents died for a few meters of French soil. In the lower galleries where the May 8th explosion occurred, forensic teams find evidence of the cooking fire that started the disaster: charred wood fragments, melted metal containers, residue from flamethrower fuel that matched Staff Dr. Hallower's witness report exactly. The blast patterns on the walls confirm his account of the fireball that swept through the tunnels at hurricane speed. Even the thickness of soot deposits corresponds to his descriptions of the suffocating smoke that killed hundreds of German soldiers. The memorial wall hiding 679 German corpses becomes controversial in modern France. Some politicians argue that enemy soldiers shouldn't be commemorated on French soil. Veterans, groups counter that the dead deserve respect regardless of nationality. The debate misses the essential point. These aren't enemy soldiers anymore. They're archaeological evidence of human folly preserved in concrete and darkness. Their presence in Fort Douaumont tells the story more powerfully than any monument to victory or defeat. But the real mystery isn't why Fort Douaumont fell. It's why General Joffre made the catastrophic decision to disarm it. Recently declassified documents from the French military archives reveal the answer. Joffre believed the Somme offensive would end the war in 1816. Every gun went in hotness. Every shell, every trained soldier had to go west for the great breakthrough that would drive Germany back to the Rhine. The Verdun forts were an expensive luxury France couldn't afford when victory was so close. The decision cost France 300,000 casualties and turned Verdun into a symbol of national suffering. The German perspective emerges from documents captured by Soviet forces in 1945 and released after the Cold War ended. Crown Prince Wilhelm's private diary describes his shock at receiving news of Douaumont's capture. A miracle, he writes on February 25, 1916, the strongest fortress in France taken by one man with a rifle. But by May, the miracle becomes a nightmare. Wilhelm's entries after the explosion reveal German commanders' growing awareness that Fort Douaumont is a death trap. Our soldiers die by the hundreds in their concrete tomb, he notes. Perhaps the French were wiser to abandon it. Pioneer Sergeant Felix Kunz's personal story emerges from Thuringian Regional Archives, opened in 1995. Born in 1891 to a farming family near Erfurt, he enlisted in 1914 as part of the great patriotic wave that swept Germany. His letters home describe the excitement of the early war, when German armies advanced toward Paris and victory seemed certain. By 1916, his tone changes. "Oh, the war has become a machine that eats men," he writes to his sister in January. "We feed it our bodies, and it gives us back mud and death." His final letter, dated July 3rd, 1916, reaches his family 2 weeks after French snipers kill him carrying dispatches near Fleury village. "Tell them I did my duty," Kunze writes. "I tell them the fortress fell because one man decided to walk through an open door." The letter becomes part of a collection published in East Germany during the 1970s, but censors remove any reference to Kunze's role in capturing Fort Douaumont. The communist government prefers to emphasize German defeats rather than victories, even tactical ones that led to strategic disasters. Lieutenant Eugen Rathke's memoirs, discovered in family papers donated to the German Federal Military Archives in 2008, provide the most detailed account of conditions inside Fort Douaumont during German occupation. He describes the constant fear of French bombardment, the impossible overcrowding, and the gradual breakdown of military discipline as soldiers realize they're trapped in a concrete maze with no escape. The strongest fortress in the world, Radke writes, now becomes the most dangerous place on earth for its own defenders. The French colonial troops who finally recaptured Fort Douaumont left their own archaeological record. Moroccan coins dated 1916, Senegalese amulets mixed with French equipment, Somali daggers alongside standard-issue rifles. These artifacts tell the story of France's colonial empire drawn into European war. Men from the Atlas Mountains and the African savannah died in French tunnels for causes they barely understood. Their contribution to French victory gets minimal mention in official histories, but the archaeological evidence preserves their sacrifice in concrete and steel. Recent geophysical surveys using ground-penetrating radar reveal the full extent of damage from the May 8th explosion. The blast created cavities in the concrete structure that engineers are only now mapping completely. Some areas remain too unstable for human entry, sealed since 1916 with the bodies of German soldiers still trapped in the rubble. Fort Douaumont becomes one of the largest war graves in Europe, a necropolis disguised as a tourist attraction. The fortress also preserves evidence of the first chemical warfare in human history. Gas residue detected in ventilation shafts matches French records of chlorine and phosgene attacks during German occupation. Soil samples from the surrounding area show contamination levels that persist over a century after the battle ended. The very ground around Fort Douaumont remains poisoned by the industrial chemicals that transformed warfare from a contest of courage into a battle of chemistry and mass production. But perhaps the most revealing artifacts are the simplest ones. Cigarette papers scattered through the tunnels where German soldiers tried to maintain normal routines while surrounded by death. Playing cards marked with dates from soldiers trying to track time in the eternal darkness underground. Carved initials in concrete walls where young men left their names for posterity, not knowing they would die nameless in an explosion that erased identity along with life. The strategic impact of Fort Douaumont's capture extends far beyond the Battle of Verdun. German possession of the fortress allows their artillery to observe and direct fire on French positions throughout the salient. Supply lines become impossible to maintain under constant observation. French counterattacks are spotted before they begin, leading to preemptive bombardments that shatter assault troops before they reach German trenches. One captured fortress multiplies German defensive effectiveness across the entire Verdun sector. French attempts to retake Fort Douaumont between February and October 1916 cost an estimated 80,000 casualties. Division after division assault the fortress, only to be cut down by machine gun fire from positions they can't locate or destroy. The concrete structure absorbs artillery bombardments that would level an entire city. French soldiers call these attacks going to Calvary, a reference to the hill where Jesus Christ was crucified. The comparison becomes uncomfortably accurate as French infantry are repeatedly sacrificed for symbolic objectives with no tactical value. The psychological impact on French morale proves even more devastating than the tactical consequences. Fort Douaumont was supposed to be impregnable. French propaganda had spent decades describing the fortress system as an iron wall that no enemy could breach. When the strongest link in that wall falls without a fight, French confidence in their military leadership collapses. Desertions increase. Mutinies spread through the French army. The capture of one fortress nearly breaks French will to continue fighting. German morale receives an equally dramatic boost. If the strongest fortress in France could fall to 98 random soldiers, what couldn't the German army accomplish? Recruitment increases in Germany as the story of Fort Douaumont spreads through newspapers and propaganda films. The Kaiser uses the victory to justify continued resistance against the British blockade that's starving German civilians. Our soldiers can overcome any obstacle, he proclaims. Victory is inevitable when German courage meets enemy weakness. But the German celebration proves premature. Holding Fort Douaumont costs more German lives than capturing it saved. The fortress becomes a shell magnet that draws French artillery fire like a lightning rod attracts electricity. German supply runs to the fort become suicide missions through a constant rain of shells. The medical staff struggles to treat casualties in underground tunnels that reek of gangrene and death. By summer 1916, German commanders privately discuss whether the fortress is worth the cost of holding it. The May 8th explosion settles the debate. After losing nearly 700 men in a single morning, German generals realize that Fort Douaumont has become more liability than asset. Plans begin for strategic withdrawal from the fortress, but French pressure prevents an orderly evacuation. When French colonial troops attack in October, they find German forces already in the process of abandoning positions. The recapture of Fort Douaumont succeeds because German defenders are fleeing, not because French attackers are particularly effective. The battle's aftermath reveals the true cost of the Fort Douaumont operation. German casualty reports, declassified in 1992, show that defending the fortress cost the German army approximately 12,000 dead and wounded between February and October 1916. Pioneer Sergeant Felix Kunz's single-handed capture of the fort led directly to losses equivalent to an entire German division. The most successful tactical operation in German military history became one of their most expensive strategic mistakes. French records tell a similar story of Pyrrhic victory. Retaking Fort Douaumont required the deployment of 3 full divisions and the construction of 2 400mm railway guns. The total cost in men, materials, and money exceeded what France spent on some entire offensive campaigns. The fortress that fell to 1 German soldier required 60,000 French troops to recapture. The mathematics of modern warfare render individual heroism both more dramatic and more futile than ever before in human history. The technological lessons of Fort Douaumont influence fortress design for the rest of the 20th century. Concrete alone cannot guarantee security if human factors fail. The strongest fortification in the world becomes vulnerable when its garrison is reduced to 56 men commanded by a sergeant. No amount of steel and concrete can substitute for adequate manpower and proper leadership. Military engineers around the world study the capture of Fort Douaumont to understand how human weakness can negate technological superiority. But the most important lesson is moral rather than military. Fort Douaumont demonstrates that individual initiative can change the course of history in unexpected ways. Pioneer Sergeant Felix Kunze ordered to clear obstacles for an infantry assault that never happened. Instead, captured the strongest fortress in France because he was curious enough to look through an open window. His decision to enter the fort alone, against orders and against common sense, altered the strategic balance of the entire Western Front. The irony deepens when you realize that Felix Kunze never intended to become a hero. Military records show he was a reluctant soldier who enlisted only because German law required military service. His letters home describe war as a boring, terrifying waste of human life. He captured Fort Douaumont not from patriotic fervor, but from professional duty and personal curiosity. The man who performed the most celebrated feat of arms in German military history was primarily interested in getting through the war alive so he could return to farming. That combination of ordinary motivation and extraordinary consequence defines the essential character of the First World War. Millions of normal people, thrown into abnormal circumstances, create results that no one expects or intends. Fritz Haber develops poison gas to end trench warfare quickly and humanely. Instead, he creates weapons that make warfare more terrible and prolonged. Ferdinand Foch designs the Maginot Line to prevent another German invasion. Instead, he creates a strategic mindset that makes France vulnerable to exactly the kind of mobile warfare Germany develops in response. Pioneer Sergeant Felix Kunze fits perfectly into this pattern. A farmer's son who wants nothing more than to return to his fields becomes the central figure in the longest battle of the most destructive war in human history. His individual courage and initiative create consequences that ripple across continents and generations. The capture of Fort Douaumont helps prolong the Battle of Verdun, which helps break French offensive capability, which helps create the conditions for mutiny in the French army in 1917. The strategic cascade continues through the remainder of the war. French forces tied down at Verdun cannot participate in other offensives. British and Russian allies must compensate for French weakness by launching premature attacks with inadequate preparation. The Somme offensive begins earlier than planned to relieve pressure on Verdun. Russian forces attack in the east before they're ready. Italian armies assault Austrian positions in the Alps without sufficient artillery support. One German sergeant's decision to climb through a window reshapes military operations across 3 continents. The human cost accumulates in ways that pure statistics cannot capture. In the village of Kunze's birth, 17 young men die in the war. Their names appear on a memorial erected in 1920, but Felix Kunze's name is not among them. He's listed as missing in action because his body was never recovered from the shell crater where French snipers killed him. His family waits until 1919 for official notification of his death. His mother dies in 1921, still hoping her son will return from the war that ended 3 years earlier. Second Lieutenant Kurt von Brandis lives with the consequences of stolen glory for 56 years after the war ends. His private papers, donated to German military archives by his family in 1998, revealed decades of guilt and rationalization. I reported what I saw, he writes in his diary in 1932. I never claimed to be the first man into the fortress. The newspapers created the myth. Not me. But he never corrects the record publicly, never acknowledges Felix Kunze's role in the capture. Fame becomes a prison as comfortable as it is dishonest. The archaeological record provides the final judgment on who really captured Fort Douaumont. In 2012, French and German historians conduct a joint excavation of the fortress's lower levels. In the storage room, where Kunze trapped the French garrison, they find spent cartridge cases from a German Luger pistol. The brass bears manufacturing marks from the Erfurt arsenal where Thuringian regiments received their weapons. Chemical analysis of the metal matches, samples from other Luger cartridges fired by the 24th Brandenburg Regiment during the Battle of Verdun. More evidence emerges from the officers' mess where Kunze stopped for his meal. Broken crockery scattered across the floor, bears' fingerprints preserved in a century-old layer of dust and debris. Modern forensic techniques identify the prints as belonging to someone with the calloused hands of a manual laborer, not the soft fingers of an aristocratic officer. The man who ate French eggs in the captured fortress worked with his hands for a living. Pioneer Sergeant Felix Kunze was a combat engineer. Second Lieutenant Kurt von Brandis was a staff officer who had never held a tool heavier than a fountain pen. The truth about Fort Douaumont also emerges in unexpected places. Soviet archives opened after the Cold War contained German documents captured in World War II. Among them, a report filed by Major von Klüfer, battalion commander of the 24th Brandenburg Regiment, dated March 2, 1916. The report describes the capture of Fort Douaumont in clinical military language. Pioneer Sergeant Kunze entered the fortress first and secured the main garrison. Lieutenant Ratka organized the occupation of defensive positions. Second Lieutenant von Brandis arrived last and filed the victory report. The document disappears into Soviet files for 70 years, while von Brandis enjoys celebrity status in Germany. Only in 1991, when Russian historians begin returning captured German military archives, does Major von Klüfer's report surface. By then, Felix Kunze has been dead for 75 years. Kurt von Brandis dies the following year, taking his secrets to the grave. Justice delayed becomes justice denied by the passage of time and the mortality of witnesses. But Fort Douaumont preserves its own testimony in concrete and steel. The embrasure window where Kunze first entered the fortress remains exactly as it was on February 25th, 1916. Visitors can still see the gouges in the concrete where German boots scraped against the walls. The storage room door that locked from the outside still bears scratches from French fingernails, as the trapped garrison tried to claw their way to freedom. The officers' mess still contains the table where a German sergeant ate French bread, while the strongest fortress in France fell without a shot. These physical traces matter more than official reports or newspaper accounts. Stone doesn't lie. Steel doesn't embellish. Concrete doesn't seek glory or deny credit to deserving men. The archaeological evidence at Fort Douaumont tells the story of February 25th, 1916, more accurately than any human witness who survived to be interviewed. The fortress itself becomes the most reliable narrator of its own capture. Modern military historians use the Fort Douaumont case study to illustrate the difference between tactical success and strategic wisdom. Felix Kunze's capture of the fortress was individually brilliant and collectively disastrous. His courage and initiative created a German stronghold that attracted 8 months of French attacks, costing both sides hundreds of thousands of casualties. The most successful small unit action in German military history led directly to one of Germany's most expensive defensive battles. The lesson applies beyond military affairs to any situation where individual excellence produces systemic failure. Corporations, where brilliant employees create products that bankrupt their companies. Political movements, where charismatic leaders inspire followers to pursue self-destructive policies. Scientific research programs, where breakthrough discoveries lead to weapons that threaten human survival. Fort Douaumont demonstrates that heroism and wisdom are not synonymous, that tactical genius can create strategic catastrophe. The deeper lesson involves the relationship between intention and consequence in human affairs. Pioneer Sergeant Felix Kunze intended to clear obstacles for an infantry attack. Instead, he captured the strongest fortress in France and prolonged the bloodiest battle in human history. His individual success contributed to collective disaster for both German and French armies. Good intentions and skillful execution can produce results that satisfy no one and benefit nothing except historical irony. Perhaps that's why Fort Douaumont endures as more than a tourist destination or military museum. It represents the fundamental unpredictability of human action under extreme circumstances. A farmer's son with a rifle changes the course of world history by climbing through an unguarded window. An aristocratic officer steals credit for courage he never displayed and lives with the lie for the rest of his life. A concrete fortress built to protect France becomes a tomb for German soldiers who died defending it from French attacks. These contradictions define not just the Battle of Verdun, but the entire character of modern warfare. Technology promises precision, but delivers chaos. Military science claims predictability, but produces surprise. Industrial organization attempts efficiency, but creates waste on an unprecedented scale. Fort Douaumont embodies all these paradoxes in 30,000 square meters of steel, reinforced concrete, stained with the blood of a dozen nations. Today, a century after Felix Kunze first entered its tunnels, Fort Douaumont stands as testament to the unpredictable consequences of individual courage in the face of systematic horror. Visitors walk the same corridors where a young German sergeant wandered alone, changed history, and died forgotten. They see the memorial wall where 679 German soldiers lie entombed, victims of their own carelessness with explosives. They observe the silence, where once the strongest fortress in the world echoed with the sound of men killing and dying for causes that time has rendered meaningless. The final irony is that Fort Douaumont, designed to prevent German invasion of France, now serves as a monument to Franco-German reconciliation. The fortress that symbolized national hatred in 1916 becomes a shrine to international cooperation in the 21st century. German and French schoolchildren visit together, learning about the war that nearly destroyed European civilization. Their teachers use Fort Douaumont to illustrate how quickly progress can reverse, how easily civilization can collapse, how desperately humanity needs institutions stronger than nationalism and wisdom deeper than military victory. But the most powerful lesson requires no teacher and no explanation. It lives in the concrete walls that still bear scars from century-old explosions, in the tunnels where Felix Kunze walked alone into history, in the silence where 679 German soldiers sleep their eternal sleep, sealed forever in the fortress they died defending. Fort Douaumont speaks its own truth to anyone willing to listen. Individual courage matters. Individual consequences endure. Individual choices echo through generations in ways no one can predict or control. In the end, that's the real story of how 98 Germans destroyed Verdun's strongest fort during World War I. Not that they succeeded, but that their success created failures. Not that they captured the fortress, but that the fortress captured them. Not that one man's heroism changed history, but that history changed the meaning of heroism itself. Fort Douaumont fell because Felix Kunze decided to look through an open window. Everything else followed from that single moment of curiosity in the darkness of war.